Thank you, Kathy, the Pro Dairy Group, Dairy Business for inviting us here. I'm going to go over milk quality, and I think the title that was chosen was, What's Your Problem? Today, we're going to go through components of the milking system, maintenance intervals, and then we'll get more into goal setting. We're going to cover the first stuff pretty quickly. I think it's really important that we look at milking equipment and either rule it in or rule it out, and then we'll talk about goals. So the reason that we chose What's Your Problem is, how many of you already today or sometime today are going to check something related to the farm? Be it cell count, go online, look at bacteria count, go back, turns per hour, something related to the milking center. So we have all this data at our fingertips, and it's wonderful, but I'm going to try and get us to refocus a little bit and realize that we have to take a step back and go into our milking centers to see why are we actually getting the numbers that we're getting. So the focus is going to be more that way. And just to put up here, I mean, on a daily, per milking shift to daily, weekly, monthly, we can get all kinds of information at the bulk tank level, the cow level, and within our own milking center. So factors affecting mastitis, we have our agent, which Dr. Jess talked about, so what our organism is. The environment plays a big factor, and then the cow. So if we look at milking routines, the equipment, the environment, the bacteria, and the cow, which area do we as producers, consultants, veterinarians, which area do we have the most control over? Which one? Routines, equipment, the environment, the organism, or the cow? What do you guys think? Equipment? Routine. We have the most control over the routine because it's our routine. We develop the routine. What area has the most variation? Out of those 5, which one has the most variation? I say the routine. We have the most, it's different. If every person, every one of us could go to the same farm right now, be trained on the same routine, and we're all going to do one thing different. And the reason I bring this up is it's really important that we have our routine in tune before we go in and do anything. If that's out of whack, all the evaluations we do are for naught. The same is for equipment, and we'll go into that in a second here. But relationship between milking equipment and mastitis. So prior to coming back to Cornell, I worked for one of the major milking manufacturers, and oftentimes, and I still hear it, I think a lot of blame is placed on equipment. Equipment is the reason we have this issue. We made this capital investment in the equipment, and it's supposed to milk our cows and be trouble-free. I'm here to tell you that I think 20% of the time or less, it's actually equipment related. Humans, it doesn't matter if it's the milkers, the ownership, or the management, that's the real player in our milk quality related concerns or issues. Equipment is not a huge player. We'll go into this. So I want to go through real quick the milking system, and I want to do this because there's guidelines out there on how to properly evaluate a milking system, and if we properly evaluate it, at the end of that evaluation, we can determine right then or there, is the equipment part of our issue? We can rule it in or we can rule it out. We'll go through a study that Pro Dairy did on looking at what it costs for maintenance and repairs in a parlor. It's really good. But in terms of the milking system, we have a vacuum pump, a regulator or vacuum controller. We have the receiver, pulsators, a claw, and the vacuum lines. Out of those 6, there's 2 of them that are usually what I would call our concerns or our major issues. Which 2 is it? If something's going to malfunction out of those 6, what 2 is it? Which 2? Pulsator and regulator, absolutely. Pulsators fail and we can have issues with teat end damage, milking out. And regulators, not as big of a concern today, but as we've shifted more away from mechanical regulators to variable speed drives or frequency drives, it's less of a player, but regulators historically have been a neglected piece of equipment that may be up in the rafters. Regulators all have some sort of filter on them, correct? What's a filter designed to do? Filter the air, right? So a filter is going to get dirty. When's the last time anybody cleaned the filters on a regulator? So that's, it really impacts the overall stability of a system. So why do we evaluate milking equipment? The real issue is to stabilize vacuum fluctuations. We have this milking system that's designed to milk cows. We utilize vacuum to harvest milk, and we want to stabilize vacuum fluctuation. Optimization is part of it today too. So if I can come to your farm, or anybody can come to your farm and say, hey, we can lower vacuum by 0.2 of an inch and still get the same standards, we're probably going to lower our overall energy usage. Just less hertz used that way. So the National Mastitis Council has very clear guidelines based off of ISO, so I highly recommend that if you haven't had your system evaluated, that you have it done. I'm going to skip this because we're a little short on time. So I was just going to cover a little bit on regulators. Regulators are designed to obviously control the vacuum level. So if vacuum starts to rise, they let air in, so on and so forth. If it goes down, they stop it. So this is what regulators are really important for vacuum stability when we look at milking unit fall-offs, during attachment, anything like that. They're very, very important that way. Pulsators. What's the issue with pulsators in terms of, everybody said if there's a component that's going to fail, if it's going to affect milk quality, one of the two that you guys said was a pulsator. How does a pulsator negatively impact the cow? If it's not functioning properly because it gets dirty. So, and the other thing that was said was improper milk out. Pulsator, we have a milk phase and a rest phase. During the milk phase, is the liner open or closed? Is there vacuum at the teat end during milk phase? Yep. So during the milk phase, we have liners open, we have vacuum, we're extracting milk. During the rest phase, the liner's closed, no vacuum, or leaving congestion. If I told you the term pulsation failure, is pulsation failure in terms of affecting the cow's teat? Is pulsation failure when it stays open in the milk phase and we have straight vacuum at the teat end, or it's closed and we don't milk it out? What's worse? Straight vacuum at the teat end, we harvest milk. Closed, we don't milk it out. Guess not milking it? So I'm going to actually say that it's worse if it's in the milk phase. That's actually no pulsation. It's straight vacuum. We have congestion. Over time, you're going to damage the teat tissue in the teat end. That's the real underlying issue with pulsation, is if we go into a failure, we're in milk mode. Not milking out a quarter. Is that going to lead to an increased risk of mastitis? Potentially, but the risk is a lot greater when we over milk that teat. So with that being said, we graph pulsators and we have these standards. The one thing when I'm consulting with farms that I try to get them to do is at the beginning of every single milking, you should at least stick your finger in every liner and make sure it opens and closes. It's not going to tell you what the phases are, but it's going to tell you, is at least that liner, that quarter, that side functioning properly. So go through and check that out so you can rule your pulsators out at every milking shift. The claw I throw in here, and the only reason I put this in here is because claws have vents on them. And we now have liners with vents. And what's the reason that we have vents? Let a little air in so we don't have an airlock with vacuum and with milk. When's the last time anybody's checked the vents on their claw? Anybody check them at every milking? Probably should. It's very important. It leads to vacuum instability at the teat end. They make special devices, little needles. Don't go get a thumbtack or a paper clip or anything. You'll actually bore those out to be larger. But it's really important to at least make sure that you check those and make sure that they're open. They're there for a reason. Just go through a few daily things here. In terms of maintenance, we need to check things related to the whole milking system on a daily, weekly, monthly. so on. So we need to check and see that all hoses, gaskets, inflations, this is kind of part of your, as you're going to check to see if you have pulsation on each liner, is to make sure that you don't have tears in hoses, anything like that. It should be done at least once a day. As we've went away from taking milking units back to the milk house and went to more CIP and milking centers, in my eyes, my opinion, the most neglected area is cleaning the exterior of milking units. It needs to be done. I'm not saying you have to do it after every milking, but at least once a day you need to go through and do some sort of physical scrubbing, cleaning, something of our milking units. You can see in the top picture, I mean, that's a pretty dirty claw at any time during milking. So check liner vents, claw vents, so on. Weekly, you need to check if you have mechanical regulators or anything that has a clean air system. We need to check filters, short air tubes. Monthly maintenance, I would say on a farm running around the clock, you should probably graph your pulsators at least monthly. In a operation where you're milking twice a day for a couple hours each milking shift, I would say at least 3 times a year you need to graph your pulsators to find out, are they functioning properly. I put these pictures up. If you look at the top one, duct tape is not a gasket for a pulsator. It's really important if you're going to go out and graph these to make sure they are up to snuff before you do it, because what's the point of graphing it other than to show, hey, it's not going to function properly. The bottom picture is a air-actuated pinch valve. Anybody knows what happens to hose after pinch valves close on them for a while? Gets deformed. So on this farm, they were using a syringe to help push the hose back this way and keep it open during times of milking when the valve was open. So again, those type of things need to be removed from the system before you do an evaluation. In 6 to 12 months, at least once a year, you need to have a complete equipment evaluation. ProDairy did a really good study and put the numbers to it and looked at in New York State, what does it cost for Parlour repair and maintenance? 5 cents per hundredweight, or 3.9% of our Parlour operation, our expenses there. It's minimal, and I bring this up because I'm a firm believer that equipment usually isn't the issue. It's fairly inexpensive to maintain in terms of other costs. When we look at debt on the capital investment and paying labor, it way outweighs this. But you can quickly rule it in or rule it out as part of your issue. You can know when you go in, we'll go through the 10 steps that when we do Parlour evaluations or milking center evaluations, what we're looking for. I think an NMC evaluation should be done first, because if your equipment isn't functioning properly, it's actually probably part of the reason that you're getting the numbers that you're getting. So we need to make sure we can rule it out. Okay. So take-home points on equipment monitoring. It's required on a daily basis. Your eyes and your ears can tell you a lot about equipment, so you need to go out, take a look, see what's going on, listen, and be able to rule it in or rule it out. Scheduled maintenance. How many of you work with the farm or on your farm participate in a scheduled maintenance program? How many of you rely on emergency calls? I'm not going to sit here and say that scheduled maintenance is cheaper than emergency calls. However, it rules out the phone call on Easter Sunday that they have to come work on a vacuum pump. It's hard on everybody. So scheduled maintenance, I think, is important. And kind of to just reiterate this whole thing on equipment, typically mechanical malfunctions are constant. Whatever's going to take place and is going wrong, it's usually taking place the same all the time. So if we have an issue with something shorting out or one side of the barn, the pulsation not working, it's always not working. It's not like milker A or milker B and one of them attaches this way and that way. It's usually something systematic that we can find pretty easily. I mean, if you have a good service group that can come out and monitor this. So to take home, the end point on equipment is, if your equipment's not up to snuff, you're not going to achieve your milk quality or your overall herd goals. So I think it's something that should be done primary, done initially, and it'll take care of, like I said, you can rule it in, rule it out. So, any questions on anything equipment related before we move on? Anyone? Yes. Do I recommend vented liners? So we have liners out there on the market now that have vents both in the short milk tube and in the mouthpiece. You can have either way. They're fine. I'm not going to say that you can't have one versus the other or having a vented claw. The only thing is be very careful. I've seen situations where people will say when you put in a vented liner, we need to then seal off the vent on the claw. In that scenario, you need to make very certain if you have a vented claw and you went to a vent in the mouthpiece, if you then put it in CIP, you've basically blocked the vent on the mouthpiece and on the claw, and your unit will airlock during cleaning. If the vent is on the short milk tube, it doesn't impact that, and you may be able to go that route. So don't think of it just in terms of milking. You can have an impact on washing if you go and try and seal one off. With that being said, it's okay to actually leave them both open. You're going to have to probably increase your vacuum a couple tenths to maintain your stability. So, okay. The next thing we're going to go on to is kind of goals and how do we get to our overall goals for the herd. Part of my training in epidemiology, I'm big on defining things. We have to define something in order to measure it. So in order to monitor or measure performance, we have to define whatever we're going to measure. The bigger thing that I'm seeing today, it's not that it's not defined. What we've defined as a goal for the herd sometimes is different for the owner versus the herd manager versus the milkers. And we need to make sure everybody's on the same page on what the goal is and how it's being monitored. So clearly defining it, I think, is very important. So the thought process here, there's really three main areas. We have people, we have cows, and I put equipment in here. This could be equipment, facilities, anything. There's really three interacting parts. And the idea here is to get you to think in terms of we have all these numbers, but how do people, cows, and our equipment or facilities play into that number that we're looking at? I can go into Dairy Comp right now and look at clinical mastitis or look at Dairy 1 records and look at cell count, but those numbers alone don't tell me why you're either achieving or not achieving the goal that you've set. So let's go to this. I like to use this little diagram. So we have our overall herd goals, and then we have the cow, and I'm going to put the parlor or the milking center, the bulk tank, and the pen. So kind of getting into the facilities aspect of it. So what are the measurables? At the cow level, we can look at the somatic cell count, we can look at mastitis, we can look at the organism. In terms of the bulk tank, again, we can look at cell count for the whole herd. We can look at bacteria count. We can start talking SPCs, LPCs, coliform counts, PIs. Those play into cow cleanliness. We could have washing issues, so on. Pounds of milk shipped. The parlor or the milking center, we can look at turns per hour, milk per stall per hour. We can look at the number of employees we have. And then in the pen, we can look at bedding or bacteria counts, cow cleanliness. There's way more. I'm just throwing these up here. But if these are the measurables that we're going to look at, what impacts the measurables? So at the level of the cow, what impacts what we said on the last page, the cell count and mastitis? People impact it, right? How do people impact cell count or mastitis? Anybody ever heard the definition that mastitis is a disease in cattle caused by a man? I mean, so we play really into it pretty heavily. Equipment can play into it. I think it's minimal, but it's part of it. Facilities, age of animal. If we have an older herd, we may expect a little bit more mastitis. Stage of lactation. If we have a very, a bunch of animals really early in milk, we may expect a little more coliform mastitis, depending upon what's going on in the dry period. The bulk tank, what affects our cell count, bacteria count in the bulk tank? People, the cow, equipment. If our equipment's not washing properly, that could be part of the whole bacteria count issue. In the parlor, our design of the parlor, so facilities, equipment, people. So I think we get the picture that it's all about linking the cow, the people, and the equipment. It's really, really important that we sit down and say, why are we looking at these numbers, or why are we here? So when we look at goals and trying to achieve what we're going, the whole reason we monitor really a goal is to find the bottleneck. If we're not achieving it, we're going to focus on it. We've said that's important, so now we find the bottleneck. Once we've accomplished or achieved that bottleneck, we move on to the next one. So clearly defining it is really important. And the one thing I want to put in here, and I always say, is change is the only constant. Dairy herds are not static. Everything is always changing, so we have to be able to adapt. Something may affect why we did or did not achieve our goal, and we need to be able to look at why that happened. Milking time evaluation. This is something that within our group we've taken on quite a bit lately. And it's this hoe to determine if it's machine versus mechanical versus cow versus human related, and look at the whole picture. So why do we evaluate milking performance? Why do we go through and do this? Again, we want to look at what our goals are, so we have to be able to measure them. But for example, maybe cow throughput is the key for you. Well, how are we going to achieve that? We have to go through and look at some parameters of detacher settings, slow milking cows, so on. In terms of that, we have theory and we have reality. What's theory? What's a theory? It's an idea. What's ideal? Yeah. Is it supported by facts? No. So it's an idea. Idea is that it's intended to explain facts or events. So it's intended. It's possibly true. What's reality? Facts. It's true. It exists. This is where I want to get you to think for the rest of this. So we can sit down right now and say, our cell count is 200,000. Our goal is for it to be 150,000. And if that's all we do, we don't know why it's there. Reality is we have to go look at the tie stall barn or the freestall barn. We have to go look at the bedding we're putting in the stalls. We have to go through a milking time evaluation to find out why are we not achieving that goal that we set in place. So it's great to sit back and say on our smartphone that we're not achieving it and here's the reason why, but we have to step in the parlor. It's part of the reason I enjoy actually looking at cow hygiene or scoring teats, because it puts me in the parlor to see what's going on at that time. So are we interested in theory or reality? We're interested in reality. So what to evaluate? This is something as more focused lately within QMPS. There's a couple of us that have come on with a background in equipment, and we've really strived to go out and add this to our toolbox per se. But when we do a milking time evaluation, we're looking at timing of the routine, T-den health, so we're doing T-den scoring, T-den cleanliness, milking unit alignment. We look at claw vacuum. We do lactocorders or graphs to see if we get bimodal milk flow. Udder hygiene. We do hand strip yields to determine if you're over milking or not. That's probably one of my favorite ones, is to talk to producers or clients and they'll say, our detachers are set at 2.2 pounds for 6 seconds. Well, how do you know that's actually what's happening? We have to go out and actually determine, is that taking place? Are we over milking or not based on the setting? Graphing pulsators and then an NMC evaluation. So this is a process that actually takes an entire milking and at least 2 people. And I think after that, we can sit down and have a discussion and say, you know what? You've achieved your goal and it's time to move on to the next bottleneck or the next one that we're not achieving. Or this might be the reason you're not achieving it. So milking routines, it's kind of as simple as how are people moving through the parlor. There's what milkers have been trained and how we want them to move, and it's how they're moving. And we need to look at, is that impacting what's going on? So briefly, just grouping versus territorial and sequential routines. We have different ways we can move through the parlor. We definitely see the most grouping in territorial, where we'll have 1 or 2 milkers or more, doesn't matter. They each work a set of cows. So if you had a double 16, you may have 2 milkers, they're each prepping 8 cows. Sequential routines is something that, if any of you have heard me speak before, I'm a big proponent of. If you're actually focusing on cow throughput, and especially if you have a lot of turnover, sequential routines are very easy to train because you have 2 milkers, one does one task, the other does the other task. The key there is timing. It is the most similar to a rotary parlor in terms of movements, and we can actually milk more cows in a sequential routine because instead of having 2 milkers doing the exact same thing at the exact same time on the exact same side of the parlor, one of them's prepping cows while the other one is finishing loading, then post-dipping the other side, and then when they start their routine, the other milker finishes post-dipping, exiting the cows, loading, and you get more of this assembly line going. I just want to throw it out there because I think it's something that if you really focused on throughput, it might be something to look at. Milking performance of 3X herds. Brandon Treichler and David Reed did a study a few years back that looked at basically average values on farms milking 3 times a day in terms of parlor performance, and then they took out the top 10% and looked at what are they doing. And I just throw these up there. If you're milking 3 times a day, average milk flow rate, we should be hitting 6.5 pounds. The best, we're getting over 7.5. A flow rate of another pound per minute, I think, is huge. And how do they achieve that? How do you add 1 pound per minute? Any ideas? Good prep and letdown. When we look at flow rates, does milking unit on time impact that? It's a big part of it, right? Look at pounds versus time. So if we have cows that we're over milking, the unit's staying on way too long. We'll talk a little bit more about moving slow milking cows all to 1 pen. Things like that are how you can achieve that. So where is your dairy operation compared to these, and is this something that you strive to achieve? So parlor efficiency. Any questions on the whole kind of goal setting, defining, before we move into parlor efficiency and what we do to evaluate a parlor? Yes? So like lag time? Oh, so having equal intervals. So either 12 hours or 8 hours. It's been documented pretty well. If we go from like a 13 to an 11 hour, we're going to decrease a little bit in milk yield. It's probably not a major player. If you're totally focused on cow throughput, milk yield, and so on, you're going to stay on equal intervals. But to be off by an hour is not. It's not huge. Because you have cows, even in a tie stall barn, for example, not every day every cow goes to the same stall. So what happens this morning when she was milked first and tonight she's milked last? Could be a 14-hour interval actually for that cow. So. The only routine, so the question was, what happens when you have 2 people in the parlor and then sometimes 3? What's the best routine? My answer to that is the third person never involves themselves in the prep routine. You have a prep routine set up typically for the minimum people. So if it's a double 16 or a double 20 or 25, whatever it is, and you have the third person come in, they need to not step in and take over part of the sequence that you've designed for your milking staff. They can go on and post-dip. They can get towels for the other milkers. They can start a little, whatever it may be. If you have 2 milkers and you have 3 sections set up, 3 groups, they can take over the third group, but do not interfere with, an ongoing routine. That's my answer. Sequential routine becomes difficult when you have unequal numbers of people in the parlor constantly. In terms of, if you have 2 people and then you go to 1, it doesn't work. You have to go to groups. If you always have 2, then you can do a sequential. It doesn't matter if the third one comes in or not. They can focus on the other side or another task or something else that way. So in terms of parlor efficiency, what questions do we have to ask? The first goal is how many cows do we want to milk? That's really dependent on what size is the parlor, our facilities, and so on. But what form of milker training will take place? Training's important if anybody besides yourself is doing it. Training is actually also important for yourself, just to go through and review what's going on. So what type of pre-milking routine? And we'll talk a little bit about different routines and timing. And then, so what parameters... Okay. What parameters are measured to determine parlor efficiency? In terms of milking center, what can we measure for efficiency? Cows per hour? What else? So we can do turns per hour, milk shipped, all kinds of stuff. There isn't a right answer. The idea is you need to pick a couple that are important to you and go through and do that. So number of cows to be milked. How does cow throughput, cows loading in the parlor, affect your desired goal? Can we lose time on loading cows? Absolutely. It's really where it begins. I'm a huge proponent, you can see in the top picture, I think entrances of milking centers need to be shielded. And why should we shield entrances? Don't spook. It gives cows more tunnel vision. It focuses them on the parlor. I think it's actually a bigger player on giving tunnel vision to your milkers. And it focuses them on the pit, where they belong, not up where the cows are. So their first interaction with that cow is once they get by that shielded area and they're at like what we can call the last stall or the first stall into the parlor. I think that's really important. What impact does the crowd gate have? Anybody ever train milkers on use of a crowd gate? Libby, I know you and I have talked about this extensively. Anyone ever train milkers on it? So when's the proper time to advance a crowd gate? What?
If there's open stalls in that parlor, the crowd needs to be coming forward.
Yeah, so I think that in my eyes that's partially correct. So as soon as we exit cows and the exit gate comes down, cows start coming in. It's not the right time right then to advance because we haven't moved any cows. The other thing we have to remember is we have 2 sides to the parlor and we have 1 crowd gate. So one side of cows is not moving. We need to let some cows come in, and the cows need to move a little bit, and then we need to advance the crowd gate. If we keep pushing them tight, it's a lot harder for them to move. Ideally, you should be able to walk behind the crowd gate, and the majority of cows, it should be like they're lined up at a cow show. You should be able to go along. They should all be heading, the majority of them, towards the parlor. We don't need some forward, some backward, some sideways. So proper advancement is really important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on milking routines, and other than to say it really comes down to making sure we get a cow stimulated, making sure the teat end is clean, and I think timing is the key. We've got to get the unit on at the right time. I'm not going to sit here and say that you have to do dry wipe, then dip, then strip, then dip again, use 2 towels. In terms of milk quality and cow throughput and our goals, the real player is right here. One impact. What's the difference between the top udder and the bottom one? Does it affect cow throughput? How much time do we spend on that bottom cow? 30 seconds? A minute? And how many of those are coming in on each side? What's that do to your overall milk quality, do you think? Could impact mastitis negatively, could lead to an increased bacteria count, you could lose premiums. I mean, that's really the big player in terms of achieving our goals. It's seeing this, not necessarily saying we have to do these 3 steps or these 4 steps and in this order. The cows will tell you what happens when cows come in with manure splattered all over the bottom of their udder and the back side of the front legs. Too much manure in the walkway. What else can it tell you? They're running, absolutely. So somebody's probably moving them either too quickly and or we got too much manure. So simple visual observations like this can tell you a lot about why you are or are not achieving that goal. So let's...